All right, good morning, everyone. It is 10:01. I know we're going to have a few more people joining, but there's a lot to get through today, so I wanted to go ahead and get started. So today, this is the second informational session that we're going to have for the 28 to 2031 project call. And the focus of this webinar is really going to be about project readiness more than anything else. And so we'll just do a quick review of what we discussed last time and the process, but then really going to take a deep dive into project readiness. If you've had the opportunity to read the guide for project selection that's provided online, a lot of this information will be repetitive, but I think it's really important to go through this information in depth. I do believe readiness is the most important aspect of the project evaluation process. So just want to make sure that everybody understands what we are going to be reviewing for the project readiness process so they can successfully navigate that and provide that information in the application. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go through just kind of the generics about the project development process itself. And because the project readiness evaluation process is designed to look at every aspect of project development, we'll talk about kind of the principles that underline the way we review readiness through this process. And then I'll go through the readiness evaluation criteria one by one. There are 13 areas that we look at, and I'll go through those 13 areas in depth. And then I'll talk about how we actually do the review process. Once you submit your applications, we have a process in place for conducting that review. And I think just letting y'all know what to expect on the review side of things will be helpful. And then I'll talk about some of the readiness resources that are linked in your background materials in the guide for project selection that are really relevant to the readiness process. And then I'll talk about the next steps. Again, like last time, everyone is muted by default. So if you have a question, I'll stop at certain points in the presentation. Please just raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and you can ask your question there. We do have a Q&A process if you want to submit that way. Christine is helping me monitor that. But if you have a question, please just raise your hand. I'll stop. I'll call on you and we will. And it looks like I've already got one. Hang on, Ed. Hey, Ed, you already have a question? You can unmute now.
Yeah, it's not my computer, but I went onto the website to try to download or get access to the application, and I can't get anything.
Yeah, try right-clicking and opening in a new tab. I've had this question a couple of times, and it's there's something between the application and our website that's we're trying to troubleshoot that, but you should be able to open it in a new tab and it'll open. If you want to try that right now, let me know if that works.
Okay, yeah, it worked under open a new window.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. And yeah, I expect that question. I appreciate you bringing that up because I had that again earlier this morning. So if you're having any trouble with the application, just right click, open in a new tab. For some reason, the button function in the website is causing an issue. So thanks for bringing that up. So just to remind everyone, Project Call Administration, everything is available on the webpage. After we finish these webinars, we will clean up the video and post everything up online. We will then have open office hours, which so basically we'll have set aside time where they'll be linked on the website. It'll just be an open Teams meeting that you can join, ask questions. It's really just a dedicated time for you to get in contact with staff so that you can ask any questions you may need. You can also contact us at any time through the funding@campotexas.org email. That is a separate email inbox that I monitor, and we will be responding through there. So if you have any questions related to the project call, please just send it to funding@campotexas.org. And then questions that we get from office hours through the email and any other questions that we receive. We're going to compile all of those into a frequently asked questions document that will be posted online, and then we're going to update that regularly. I think it's important that if one person has a question, that everyone has the benefit of the answers that we provide for that particular question in case they have the same one. So we're keeping that running tally all the way through January. So just keep an eye on that. We'll post that at the same time we post the first iteration of that will be posted at the same time as these webinar recordings. So today we are on our second webinar, and then we'll have a third one next week regarding the benefit evaluation. Then we'll conduct the office hours on these 4 concurrent weeks. We'll do a final information session and webinar in January. The due date is January 30th, 2026 is when your applications are due. So we wanted to make sure that that webinar on the 14th is really there, as people, I assume at this point, will actually be digging in and doing their applications at that point. Wanted to give everyone one last opportunity to ask questions before that due date approaches. At that point, we'll go through the review process, which I'll talk a little bit about today. And we are targeting a policy board action and selection on projects on June 8th, 2026. I am expecting this to be a very competitive process with a lot of applications, and so if we need a little more time to review the projects, we may extend that board action until August or September. Doesn't really change anything on the federal funding perspective or when that funding is available. So if we need a few extra months to conduct the review process thoroughly, we'll take that, but we'll definitely let everyone know at the very beginning of February once we know what we're looking at. So today we're really going to talk about step 2, step 1 to a certain extent as well, but really this is about readiness, which is determining that a project can complete all the required milestones to be implemented as scheduled. So when you submit your project, we are basically just making sure that you can pull that project off, that you've done everything you need to do to complete that project. Oftentimes it's for construction. We're making sure that if we federalize this project and select this project, that you can construct that project or implement it on schedule and on time and have everything completed in development to ensure that you can make that schedule. So a couple of things I want to kind of take a step back. This is similar to the one that I provided in the last webinar, but really as we're going through this presentation, I think there's some considerations for you as sponsors to think about when you're looking at your projects and thinking about which ones you want to submit, what is appropriately ready. I wanted you to kind of think about, these are more about the principles that underlie the process and some things to think about as we go through this presentation. One is this is about the due diligence. I think it's about demonstrating readiness. So passing through readiness requires that you as a sponsor go through kind of a diligent and thoughtful consideration of what your project needs. You can't really just throw anything together and submit it. It's really about going through a diligent and thoughtful process. And when you look at your projects, what is it that you need to get this project done? And that's really what this process is about. It's also about providing that sufficient detail. And if you're going through that diligent and thoughtful process, you're going to have the detail that's necessary for your application and for us to assess readiness. It's really just to explain and detail everything in your application so that we aren't left with any questions. And kind of getting to that, the review process is really about us. We're going to question everything in your application. If you say this is how much it costs, we're going to ask, well, how did you get to that number? Where did that number come from? It's really just asking the simple questions, why and how. Kind of like an annoying 3-year-old toddler that just keeps asking why. That's kind of how the review process goes. We're going to look at something because this is a competitive process. And sometimes we'll put whatever we think sounds good in the application. We're going to ask why. We're going to break it down. We're going to look underneath the hood and do that by asking why and how. And so I think just keep that in the back of your mind when you're developing your application. If we question something, the answer should already be in the application. This process does provide flexibility, and that's something I'll talk about, is that the process requirements do provide some flexibility. Every project is unique, and so there are certain things we are looking at. Doesn't mean that anything goes, but there is some flexibility in there because every project is going to be a different part of the development process, and every project is to a certain extent unique, and we try to give sponsors flexibility for that in the process. There's some basic guidance principles, and I think at the end of the day, your project is going to pass readiness if you understand and adhere to the basic principles of the process. And that gets back into, if you just give us the information we need to evaluate your project, don't leave us guessing, and don't leave any gaping unknowns in your project. Your project will pass readiness and move into the benefit evaluation process. And again, this is really about risks. As we evaluate projects, the unknowns, equal risk. So any unknown aspect of a project, provide brings in some level of risk to a project being able to be constructed or implemented on time. So some unknowns risk a low level of risk, and some unknowns pose a really unacceptable and high level of risk that can kill a project. And that's really what this process is about, is looking at those unknowns. Do they carry a lot of risk with them? And in a lot of ways, we shouldn't have any unknowns, depending on what you're asking for, but this is what this process is about. It's about risk. And is there risk that you're not going to be able to pull off the project on schedule and on time? Because if you don't, there's a whole cascade of negative projects or negative issues that arise, which I'll talk about. But that's really in the back of your mind. This is about, what are the unknowns and what are the risks associated with your project? So let's talk about the project development process. I think anybody who's been in this business a while and has developed projects, this on the left-hand side is a graphic, really just a high-level um, version of the project development process. So it's primarily a sequential and iterative process, and the outcomes of each phase directly informs the next phase of development. And because of the potential impacts the outcomes of one phase have on another, funding requests are only for the next viable phase of a project in relation to its current development status. So basically, we're going to look at where you are and then the next viable phase and make sure that that's what you're requesting. Again, each project is wholly unique. You may be following a variation of this development process outlined here. Regardless, every project just needs to demonstrate a defensible and deliberative development process relative to the phase that is requested. So I do want to kind of break this down a little bit quickly, but the project development process really starts with that high level need identification. A transportation problem can be identified through any number of ways. I mean, it can be, a citizen bringing it up to the, city council saying, hey, we've got this transportation issue or something like that. There's a, infinite amount of ways a project need can be identified. And that's the part where it goes into high level planning once that need is identified. And the high level concept is typically included in large scale planning documentation. This could be citywide strategic plans, county plans, or the regional transportation plans, such as our 2050 RTP. It's you identify the need, move into the high level planning, and then once a project gets prioritized, it usually moves into project level planning. And this is where a sponsor conducts a project specific planning process, which includes an analysis of existing and future conditions, develops potential project concepts and alternatives, and then evaluates those concepts for feasibility to determine the most effective solution to move forward into engineering and design. And this step is usually where there are opportunities for public engagement on the potential concepts, and that's where you also identify those constraints on the project, including environmental constraints. And so you filter those into your evaluation selection. When you pick an alternative, you typically talk to the public about those types of alternatives, getting their feedback on those potential alternatives. And you've also looked at those environmental constraints to make sure there's nothing that's would be detrimental to the project moving forward. So at that point, once you've selected your projects, that's when you move it through the engineering process. If you are federalizing it, you'll go through NEPA at this point, and then once you go through NEPA and get cleared through NEPA, you can begin the right of way and utility relocation. So these all kind of start together because in preliminary engineering, that's when you define the footprint of a physical project, and that allows you to determine the NEPA classification and go through NEPA clearance. And at that point, you kick off the right of way acquisition and utility relocation. At that point, once you've got everything teed up, you finalize design, and that you continue the engineering throughout the entire process, essentially after you've selected your concepts. But once you get to 100% planning specifications and estimates, you can go forward through the bidding process. You select your construction contractors. And it's important once you get to 100% design, you have the final and most accurate construction costs at that point. And then you go to letting and construction, which is the formal bidding process, contractor selection, and project construction. And I think this is important to go through this process. I think everyone's probably familiar with it. but this is a general process, and this is really what the readiness is based on. So we look at all of these different aspects. We look at where you are in this process and where you need to be. And so it's really the foundation of the readiness assessment. I did find this. I thought this was a just kind of a reference example as I was going through this, kind of putting together these slides. I did look at a couple of references, and I thought TechStot's project development process, they had a brochure or something that was available online, but it really describes the exact same process and kind of the time frame. So I wanted to provide it in here because I think this provides a good reference as well. Just talking about how there's this iterative process where from identifying the need all the way to construction, typical years it takes to get these things done. Again, I just thought that I would put this in here as a reference as well, just kind of as a second chart. So that's the project development process. So I want to talk about the principles of readiness, and I did mention this last time. Again, the readiness assessment evaluates projects based on the key measures that together provide a comprehensive and systematic review of a project's current and future development. These metrics were developed from industry standard project development processes with considerations of laws, regulations, and procedures that are applicable to projects that are funded through these funding programs. So a lot of this is based on what you will have to go through should your project be selected and federalized. That project development process is spelled out in TechStot's project and procedures. And so we've based this readiness evaluation process on those procedures. And again, as I mentioned earlier, understanding the importance of readiness, it's really about risk and that uncertainty. So when we make a recommendation to the policy board, they're going to be making these substantial financial investments. And this is really about what sort of risk and uncertainty a project has, and really about protecting those financial investments that we make as a region. Again, there's a host of negative impacts. If we invest in projects that are not appropriately developed or carry a significant amount of risk, we risk a lot of adverse negative effects to the impacts to the region. We can directly lose the funding, and you as a sponsor, if your project is not ready and we select it for funding, you could directly lose that funding through an appropriation lapse. The funding will go back to DC. Two of the programs that we are selecting for in this process have a 4-year time limit for obligation. If we don't get the funding obligated on your project on time, that funding will be lost both to you as a sponsor, but also to the region. We also risk funding redistribution. There is a TAC rule, Texas Administrative Code rule, that was recently implemented, where if we are not using our funding and we hit a certain threshold and our funding has not been obligated to a specific project, then the state has the authority to remove that funding from our region and redistribute it throughout the state. And then kind of the more direct impacts to you as a sponsor. Every time a schedule slides, the funding is going to be devalued every single year thanks to inflation. So you're going to lose the purchasing power on inflation due to inflation. So, if you think you can hit a certain fiscal year and then you slip by another fiscal year, a year that's going to really impact your project and how far that funding is going to go. So that's going to result into a higher cost burden for you as a local sponsor. And that's also an opportunity loss for other local sponsors and projects. If we park funding on a project that is not ready and the funding sits there being unused, not only is the inflation going to erode the purchasing power, but that's funding that you as a sponsor could be using if you have a ready project ready to go. And so that's something to consider. It's an opportunity loss for other local sponsors and projects if we're putting it on projects that are not ready. So these are kind of the high level things to me that really demonstrate the importance of going through the readiness process. And then finally, readiness is really the foundation for the benefit evaluation. If a project has not been developed appropriately, it's only when we know a project can be delivered as designed, can there be trust in the expected regional transportation benefits that are the basis of the scores, ranking, recommendation, and project selection. And so that's really important that a project has been developed appropriately. It's not going to have any significant changes to it as it goes through the design process. It's basically baked at that point, and so we know what we're getting for it. And when we know what we're getting for it, that's when we can, take it through the benefit evaluation process and those predicted benefits that we're going to receive. So I'm going to stop right there. Does anybody have any questions at that point before I jump into the actual criteria? Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and Ed, you have a question? You should be able to unmute already.
Yeah, yeah. Say, I was wondering the presentation that was made last week.
Mhm.
I noticed previously in the previous calls he had put used the PowerPoint presentation on for availability. Is that going to be the case for this um, last week's seminar and this week's seminar?
Yes, yeah, we're gonna post all of these, and this is being recorded, so we'll post the recordings and the presentations on the website. We just haven't posted the last week's yet. We'll probably end up posting all three at once after next week's session.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, if you miss anything, no worries. Everything will be posted online. Tony, you have a question? You should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, I just wanted a clarification on the project development processes. You said the funding request is for the next viable phase in that process. And then as you proceeded through it, you kind of grouped preliminary engineering, NEPA, right-of-way acquisition, utilities, and then you grouped final design, letting, and construction. Do you consider those groups like a single phase, or were you just doing that for presentation purposes?
Good question. I was doing it basically just for the presentation. So those are separate phases, and I'll talk about that in just a minute
Great.
about the available phases that you can request funding for and how you can group. Some of them you can group depending on where the project is, but I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides actually. But that's a good point and clarification. That was just for the presentation itself. So,
Thank you.
thanks. I'll continue on. Thanks for those questions. Those were good questions. So the readiness metrics that we look at, we evaluate 13 areas of the project development process, and these are going to be the 13 areas in your application in the readiness section that you'll review and put information in the application based on these 13 criteria. And these are based on that project development process. So I'm going to go through all of these on the left, just kind of step by step from eligibility all the way down to right of way and utilities. If you have any questions about a specific section, please raise your hand because there's going to be a lot of information in here. And I'm specifically going to focus on a few areas that are really, really important to readiness more than the other areas. And this is really going down to scope, cost estimate, and funding requirements are probably some of the bigger ones that I want to focus on, but I want to make sure that we have time to get through those questions if you have any, because those are really kind of, to me, those are the three that really create the heart of the readiness process and the most important pieces of your application in this particular section. So let's talk about general eligibility. So projects, again, have to meet all federal, state, and regional transportation funding eligibility requirements. And so we'll use all the information in your application to determine that your project is eligible. So we'll look at the functional classification. This is specifically for surface transportation block grant funding. There are functional classification requirements and project location requirements for your project. And so we'll look at that. There's a section in the application where you can talk about the functional classification of the current facility and the anticipated functional classification after you complete the project scope. That's for your traditional roadway projects. If it's an ITS project, we'll look at things, like the location of the ITS. And again, if it's a bridge project, typically the functional classification requirements are a little bit different for certain bridge scope projects that are going to be on bridges. And so if you have any questions about the functional classification of your projects or if it'll impact your eligibility, please let me know. Send me an email. We can go through the actual eligibilities that are linked in your document. in the background document. But I would encourage you to look at FHWA's website to look at those clarifications and caveats for any of the project scopes. Again, we're going to look at the project location, just making sure that it's in the six-county region, which is a given, but also kind of tied to the functional classification. We'll look at the project location. Project scope is going to be the other important thing in the scoping process. That's what we're going to use. We're going to look at your line item scope to determine that each of those is eligible for reimbursement through these federal programs. And then again, sponsor eligibility is kind of the other thing. There's a category of sponsors that are eligible for these funding programs, which I covered in the last webinar, but really just goes down to most government agencies are eligible, as well as nonprofits that partner with the local government. But those are listed, and that's something we will look at through the readiness process. So this kind of gets to the question, Tony, that you had, talking about project development phase eligibility. So in addition to the basic eligibilities, project scopes must be submitted for the next appropriate project development phase. So basic eligible phases for consideration of this project call. There's transportation planning activities. So if you have a project need that's been identified, but you haven't done the planning work yet, you can submit for transportation planning. If you've gone through the planning process, you can request funding for engineering up to 100% PS&E, but this is to get you, once you've selected that alternative, gone through a defensible planning process, and it's ready for engineering, you can request engineering. You can request environmental clearance funding and NEPA clearance. This is going to be really important, I think, for projects that are submitting for construction, because, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about environmental clearance in the next slide. And then obviously construction and implementation. So if you've got a non-construction program, you can submit for implementation. And then the big one is construction. Obviously, if you've gone through the engineering process, the planning process, and acquiring right of way, and you're ready for construction, that is an eligible phase. And that's probably the big one that most people are submitting for is construction. And again, certain combinations of phases can be submitted if the project is at the appropriate point of development. One thing I wanted to point out is that we wanted to give people flexibility. Sometimes you're in between phases weirdly. So we wanted to provide flexibility. If you think it's appropriate for the next stage of your project, you can submit combinations of phases, and that's what this next slide is about. So, but it's really, so you can request certain combinations of phases if it's appropriate to ensure the continued efficient development of a project. So you can do transportation planning and environmental clearance. You can do planning and engineering and design in very limited circumstances, engineering and design and environmental clearance, engineering and design and construction. If you've done the majority of your design, say if you're at 90%, but you still need to do a few refinements, but we're pretty confident in the construction estimate, you can request design refinements along with your construction. I think this is an important one too as well. If you have 100% design, but you haven't done it to federal or state standards, you can request engineering design funds to update those plans for federal and state requirements. So that's just something you'll need to look at. Construction and environmental clearance and NEPA. I think this is going to be, and I'll talk a little bit about this one in the next slide, but if you're requesting funds for construction and you have not gotten NEPA clearance, which will be a requirement of the federal funding, if you federalize the project, you can request funding to take that project through NEPA clearance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because that is, if you're requesting construction, we are assuming that you've gone through, looked at all of the environmental constraints with the project in conjunction with the design, looked at your permitting requirements, the EPICs, which are the environmental permitting commitments that you need to do. We're assuming all of that's probably been done, and then NEPA is probably wrapping that up, but that is something you can request. So basically, we're going to look at where you are and where you need to be and make sure that the next logical step is available to you. And this really just provides you some flexibility here. One thing I want to point out is that combined phase requests will be reviewed with consideration of the relationship between the two phases and in the context of the project development, and how the associated activities of each phase impact the readiness of the next. And a good example of that, I think, is transportation planning and engineering and design. So in planning is where you figure out what it is you need to do. You've gone through that deliberative decision-making process and figured out through all the alternatives that you're looking at which one you need to move forward into engineering and design. And if you haven't done enough planning, and you haven't decided what that alternative is going to be, or you've got multiple alternatives that really need digging through, you're not going to be eligible for engineering and design because there's still a lot of risk and, maybe, one alternative requires a lot more engineering and design versus another alternative, and you haven't made that selection yet, which will impact how much that engineering and design is going to cost and what it's going to take. So we're going to be looking at that context there. So if it's a complicated project, you need to complete that planning before you go into engineering design. So in an ideal world, you're going from one phase to the next to the next. But in offering that flexibility, some projects are not complex at all, and the planning process is very simple. And in that case, you might be able to justify that you've got a good estimate for the engineering design. So it's all about the context of the relationship between the two phases you're asking for. So if you're planning on asking for a phase combination, I would urge you to look at that relationship and understand it and see if the impacts of one phase will have a significant and detrimental impact on the next phase. Not a detrimental impact, but a very significant impact on it. And that's what we're going to be looking for. So one thing I do want to point out, and as I've said in the last webinar as well, if you have any questions about these phase combinations, or if you're considering it, I would encourage you to submit your scope to the funding@campotexas.org email. We can review that ahead of time just to give you concurrence and look at that relationship ahead of time. I don't want you submitting a phase combination that's not appropriate, and then we get through this readiness evaluation process and realize that. I'd rather talk through that ahead of time. So please, review those and just, I would highly, highly recommend that you submit any combined phase requests, and submit those proposed scope for review, and we'll give you concurrence or feedback prior to application submittal. I haven't required that. I feel like I should, but if you see any of these combinations and it's questionable whether or not you can do that combination, please just submit that to us for consideration, and so we can review that together and make that determination before you submit. So again, phase combination considerations. Environmental is one of those, so sponsors that are requesting environmental clearance in conjunction with any other phase other than construction, you'll need to demonstrate the need to be federally environmentally cleared. Why that's important: sponsors should not request funding for NEPA clearance if the project is not going to be federally funded for construction, or you don't have a clear timeline for the construction phase, as the results of the NEPA clearance process won't be necessary, or they'll expire and need to be redone. And so we'll spend all this money getting a project environmentally cleared, and then the results expire because 3 years has passed and the results are no longer valid. You're going to have to redo the process. So I would just keep that into consideration. NEPA clearance is really what you need to. It's a requirement of anything that receives federal funding. So projects that receive funding for pre-construction phases, such as planning or engineering, you're going to get cleared through the standard categorical exclusion clearance process. So we're still going to have to clear that particular phase in the work that you're going to do because it's federally funded, but that's going to be a standard CE. But anything above that, so if it's a construction phase project, you're going to have to undergo full NEPA relative to the project scope. So you'll either end up doing a categorical exclusion, an open-ended delist categorical exclusion, an environmental assessment, or an environmental impact statement. Those last two can take 2 to 3 years and be pretty extensive processes. So that's something we look at during this process. But if you're considering NEPA, obviously I think it's important if you're going into construction to request NEPA, but I think if it's anything pre-NEPA, you should not be requesting it unless you have a clearly defined need for clearing that project through NEPA if you're not going to construction. Hey, Tom. All right, let me real quick. Hey, Tom.
Hey, good morning.
Morning.
Do you know, or does anybody know how long a NEPA clearance lasts before you have to go through another one?
So typically you'll have, and I'll go back and check and see if the rules have changed. It's been a while since I put on my NEPA hat, but it's typically 3 years before you trigger a reevaluation. And sometimes if the project has changed dramatically, you'll have to redo the entire thing. But I'll go back and look at that and get some additional guidance on that.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. Ed, and Ed, I think you actually mentioned this at TAC yesterday. So,
Yeah, maybe. Hey, if I remember correctly, if you use federal funds for the NEPA process, either the state or the feds had a process that they might seek reimbursement of those funds that were used. Now, you might want to check on that. I just kind of vaguely remember that, but
okay.
just to make sure that everybody gets the full information about what happens if you don't complete the project, that you may have to go back and possibly reimburse the funds that were spent on the NEPA process.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, if we spend money on NEPA and then you don't federalize it later on, you have to pay that money back, which is similar to like right-of-way acquisition and things like that. If federal funds are used on that and you don't go to construction, you have to pay that money back. So that both good points.
Yeah,
So
or if you go
I'll,
PS&E and then you ask for the environmental process through the PS&E, but then the project sits on the shelf for more than 3 years, do you have to go through the environmental process again?
and my understanding is yes, you definitely have to do a reevaluation, which refreshes the existing NEPA clearance, but sometimes a reevaluation is not sufficient depending on how much has changed and how long. Um, I'll look into that. What triggers that to be redone? These are really good questions. And I'll
Thanks.
get with the Austin district because that is one thing I do want to point out that at least with environmental clearance and we do have the Austin district and the environmental team in the Austin district. We're going to review every single project and determine like where it lands in the environmental process and these types of risks. But I'll definitely get some additional guidance on that prior to all of that. So thank y'all for these questions. These are good. And Charmaine, hey, morning.
Morning. So the phase combination that applies for all three programs, or is that specifically the STBG?
It's all three programs.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for these questions. These are good, and I'm writing them down. So definitely follow up on the NEPA requirements because that will have a major impact. And again, another consideration, this is one that I mentioned earlier too, is like planning and engineering. This will be a limited phase request because and one that I think would highly encourage you to submit the scopes ahead of time because the planning process really provides that defensible, inclusive decision-making process on the concepts that you want to move into engineering and design. And if there are a lot of different concepts and you haven't quite figured out what that concept is going to look like, you could be looking at wildly different engineering costs. And so that's something that we'll be looking at is like, have you done enough planning that your engineering requests make sense? So because the outcomes of the planning process could have a significant impact on the scope and cost of engineering design. Again, this gets back to just submit that for us to review. So we're going to be requests for combined planning and engineering will be evaluated to determine the impact and risk of any planning phase outcomes that and the impacts that it could have on the engineering phase. If you haven't completed the appropriate level of planning relative to the project complexity, it's not going to be eligible for engineering and design yet. But again, please submit those scopes if you're considering that. Send us those scopes so we can concur on that combination ahead of time. So let's go into management. This is a little more straightforward. So management requirements, we're basically looking at the technical expertise and that you have the staff and resources to successfully implement the proposed project. In my experience, I think the management team and having someone, a strong project manager is, one of the critical aspects of a project being successful versus not. And obviously, turnover and things like that happen. There's, people take different jobs. And so we're just looking at the entire management ecosystem that a local government has or a local sponsor, just making sure that they have the appropriate amount of staff to successfully implement the project. So in the application itself, you'll identify the direct project manager. If you've got project support staff or a deep bench of people that are going to be helping out on the project, you can identify those individuals. We're also looking for a local government project procedures certified individual. So this is a certification. So every project that gets federal funding through this process has to have an LGBP certified individual on the project team and part of this and is a signatory, I believe, on the advanced funding agreement. So it's something that TxDOT will look at. If you don't have a certified individual, we'll look at whether if you've signed up for the course. It is a 1 or a 2-day course, essentially. I think it's a day and a half at this point, where you'll get that certification. You're certified for 3 years, and it's basically a course that takes you through the federal funding process. Excuse me. And so just making sure that you have that a certified individual. This person does not need to be the project manager, just need to be somebody on the sponsor's staff. And I want to point out that a LGPP certified individual has to be cannot be a consultant. It has to be someone who is a employee of the local government. That is a TxDOT requirement. So I just wanted to point that out. One other thing is that as part of the evaluation of management and project delivery capabilities, most, if not all, local governments have a local government risk assessment. This is conducted annually by the Texas Department of Transportation. So they basically review the same things that we're looking at here is basically the capabilities of the local government. Are there any issues, that are concerns or risks? You get graded A through D. A is the best. D is considered to be a level of unacceptable risk for TxDOT, and they will not execute an advanced funding agreement with a local sponsor that has a grade of D. So we are going to be looking at your local government risk assessment to ensure that you do not have a D. And if you have a C, that's a high level of risk, not unacceptable, but a high level of risk. And we'll look at those issues that are identified in that. So it's just a tool that we use to identify whether or not a sponsor can successfully manage a project. And we're also going to look at the delivery performance of any previously awarded projects through the Campo funding programs. Let's see, Angela, you have a question? Should be able to unmute.
Hi, thanks. Just quickly, do y'all know if the LGBT certification expires or if it's once you've received it, you're good?
It expires after 3 years.
3 years. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I actually just took my 4th one, I think, a few months back. But yeah, so Ed, you have a question?
Yeah, this may not apply, this won't apply to everybody, but maybe CARTS and Capital Metro. If we are successful in being selected for the project, we would ask the funds to be transferred to the Federal Transit Administration, which in turn would be, in our case, for CARTS, it'd be transferred back to TxDOT, but through its public transportation division, which administers the federal grants. So I guess we may, is there a process to not have to get an exemption from the LGPP certification?
Well, I'm going to say no right now because there's not a guarantee that we transfer those funds. We've done it before on a case-by-case basis, and obviously we've done it, with CARTS, and y'all are very successful. And moving forward, then it helps y'all out. That's something we'd have to do at a case-by-case basis. I think for right now, we're going to be looking at the same thing.
Okay.
Trying to think. I'm thinking through this a little bit.
Yeah. No need for an answer right now. Just want to let you know that we'll probably ask for some clarification on our particular situation. I'm not sure if Capital Metro would be interested in that option as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things. It's like, if we go through this entire process and it, for whatever reason, doesn't move forward the way it's supposed to, if it's transferred over to FTA funds, then we don't have access to redistributing that to a different projects through STBG. So things to consider. But that's a good question and a good point. I still think it's good for everyone to have the LGPP certification. And one thing I do want to point out, if you don't have current certification, you can sign up for it and just indicate when you expect to have it. So that's a good point there as well. So if you don't have it, what your anticipated date of getting certification will be. So,
Okay, all right, thank you.
thanks. Hey, Fernando.
Hey, good morning, Ryan. Yeah, a question on the sponsors' technical expertise and resources. So, will there be specific questions on the application for the project manager? And I guess how would Campo determine a strong sponsor for the projects?
Yeah, and that's one thing we basically require just the basic information. We don't require, and then there's an attachment section in the management field. And there was a program experience narrative field in the application previously. We've taken that away, but basically what we're looking for is, I would say, provide a resume or just like a brief paragraph on the experience that the project manager has would be sufficient. And then if you have, like a work chart, I think in the past, I found the work chart to be extremely helpful, like knowing where someone is in the work chart, if they've got other people that are going to be helping, just like a brief bio. But mainly on the project manager in particular, I think just a brief bio of their experience would be helpful.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks. All right, thanks for those questions. So scope. So all projects need to include a comprehensive, detailed, and accurate line item scope of activities. We're looking if it's for it to be a professionally developed scope for infrastructure projects is developed by a professional engineer, and then a planning professional for any non-construction projects. So the important thing about the scope is that it needs to clearly identify all the tasks, subtasks, and other relevant items proposed for federal funding. This is what we use to determine eligibility. The scope will also be used by TxDOT when you submit for reimbursement. They've got this list and this scope that is attached to the advanced funding agreement. And that is the list that they use to determine that, yes, we can reimburse this particular item. So it needs to be as detailed as possible and consistent with other areas of the application, including the cost estimate. And then the methodology used to develop the scope should be provided. Again, this and the cost estimate too, the methodology is probably incredibly important. We need to know how you got to, this is what you need to conduct the project. How did you get there? And so I'll talk about that a little bit. So kind of the principles of scoping. The scope is really just a complete breakdown of the activities and associated deliverables in list format. This will provide a complete picture of what this phase of project development entails and be used again for the reimbursement process. And so this is just a generic example to kind of demonstrate, what a scope might look like. Again, there's flexibility. You can develop the scope however you need, however you think is appropriate. But basically, we need to look at that list of everything you're going to be submitting and doing for this project. And so in this case, we've got task A through D. Detailed information is available with each task. And then if task, A, for example, has a breakdown, you've got detailed information on each subtask. It really just break down the scope of the project into the smallest components possible. That one tells us that you've gone through a very thoughtful and deliberate process on what you're asking for. And it really just gives us that really simple checklist that we can look at for eligibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about that scope again on the cost estimate because they're kind of one and the same in a lot of ways, but I wanted to point that out. Let's see. Paige, you have a question. Let me allow your mic. There you go.
Okay, I think you kind of answered it because, yeah, I was wondering the difference between this versus the cost estimate and also the plans, right? Because that will all be detailed in the plans as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll talk about I'll basically expand on this for the cost estimate. So, and one thing I want to point out that if it's appropriate, the scope and the cost estimate can be combined because essentially you're going to be taking the scope and adding cost and methodology to it more than anything else. And so if you think it's appropriate, you can put the same document in both sections of the application if it's appropriate for it. So yeah, that's a good question. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the cost estimate.
Okay, thank
Okay, thanks. So quickly on this one, the schedule, I'm trying to be mindful of the time. So just provide a comprehensive schedule for all the anticipated award through completion of the proposed activities. So with your scope and what you need to do to, obviously details what you need to do. The schedule will detail when you need to do it. I think one thing that's important about the schedule, provide as much detail in your schedule as possible. This will help us program it in the appropriate fiscal year. Lets us know that you've thought out everything you need to do and the sequential order in which you'll be doing it. One thing I want to point out is that you should be looking at the local government project management guide and incorporating that into your schedule. So if you're looking at federalizing this project, you're going to go through the LGPP process. So you should look at that process and see how those requirements are going to be incorporated into your scope and schedule. A good example of that is you're going to have an advanced funding agreement. That process starts around we make the project selection, the board selected, we send the award letter to you and TxDOT, and that formally kicks off the advanced funding agreement process. That can take somewhere between 6 to 8 months, depending on the complexity of the project, your internal approval processes and their approval processes. So make sure you're building that into the schedule. So we just want to look for a thoughtful schedule that don't be overly aggressive. Don't say, well, we're awarded in fiscal year, in October or November, or September, calendar year, September 2026. So we're going to be able to construct the project in October, calendar year 2026. That's not reasonable. We're just making sure that your schedule accounts for all the complexities that you have to get done, and that it gives us an accurate estimate of where that project's going to land in the schedule. Again, obviously the schedules will change. If you've ever done, worked in project development for any length of time, we all know that schedules are very, very fluid, but basically we're looking for just a thoughtful process when you put together the schedule that tells us you understand what it's going to take to get it done, and how long that's going to take. Again, location, this is pretty simple. Just you'll provide the details of your project location directly in the application, and then provide any maps and resources for us to review. If you want to provide a digital form like a PDF or a shapefile or a KMZ file for Google Earth, you can do that. Just attach that so that we have maps that we can clearly determine where your project is. So kind of getting back to what we discussed with the scope, there's a very similar thing with the cost estimate. Again, I want to point out that the scope and the cost estimate can be a combined document if you think it's appropriate. Basically, the scope is going to be A through Z, what you need to do. The cost estimate is going to say this is exactly what that's going to cost for each item. And they're really going to be combined. I would almost recommend that you combine these elements if it's appropriate for your project. So again, the cost estimate, and this is probably the beating heart of readiness to me more than anything else, is getting together an accurate, an organized, detailed line item, and accurate cost estimate and budget for the submitted project scope that has been developed by a professional engineer for infrastructure projects or a planning professional for non-construction projects and programs. The cost estimate needs to be clear and provide the appropriate details relative to the complexity of the project and be consistent with other areas of the application. It's really important that it's organized and provides that sufficient detail and clearly demonstrates every individual component of the project scope, including all the individual infrastructure items, the materials, engineering requirements, planning tasks, subtasks, deliverables, materials, and staff needs and rates, and activities that will be submitted for reimbursement through federal funding. And Ed, I do see your question. I'll get to it in just a second. So the methodology, this is probably the most important thing. I think when you're telling us and requesting federal funding, we want to know, well, how did you come up with that number? Did you have a defensible process for coming up with that cost estimate? Again, it's a cost estimate. We're looking for reasonableness, and the way we find out whether something is reasonable is the methodology. So supporting the cost estimate, just submit the cost estimate methodology and any other documentation that clearly demonstrates how that cost estimate was developed and what assumptions you've used. It's up to your professional judgment what you assume is appropriate for your project. but you have to demonstrate that so that we can double check that and make sure that it's appropriate. So cost estimates, if we don't have an accompanying methodology, or they do not clearly demonstrate a professional methodology or reasonable assumptions, we're not going to be considering that ready. Because at that point, cost estimates, if we don't know how you came up with that number, we're just going to assume it was made up, and a made up number is usually not right. So anyways, the cost estimate, we're going to review it, including an assessment of the assumptions. We're going to verify the cost data that you use, and the activity and item descriptions. So regarding inflation, so in your cost estimate, do it at today's cost. So regarding inflation and future estimates, provide your estimates for the current cost of implementation or construction at submission. When we schedule your project in a future fiscal year, we will automatically adjust your funding request for inflation. Currently, we're going to use the TxDOT rate of inflation, which is at 4%. So we'll do 4% a year up until the fiscal year where we would program it. One thing we are going to look at before we make this recommendation is whether or not the TxDOT rate is still appropriate. Ed, you actually brought up a really good point during I think it was a TAC meeting that we discussed this, that we may use a different rate from the TxDOT rate. We're going to do research across the country, look at inflation rates, see if 4% is still appropriate. Either way, we're going to use a standard inflation rate for every single project that we program. Whether or not that's the TxDOT rate or a different rate, we'll let you know on that. So kind of going back to the principles of cost estimation, this looks very similar. And Paige, this kind of gets to what you were asking. So break down the individual components. So on the left, you've seen the scope that I provided an example of. So for the cost estimate, you would essentially just add the unit costs for those associated scope items and then provide the methodology for each of those. So what this looks, I've got a couple of examples, one for a construction project and one for a planning project, just a very narrow example. So let's say, for example, task A is you need to conduct a public engagement meeting. Well, the subtasks A1 through A4 break down the kind of the four things. This is obviously a very general example, but I just want to illustrate the principles here is that public meeting venue, $5,000, and then you'll provide the assumption of why that meeting venue you think costs $5,000. Maybe that's standard. Maybe there's this particular location that you use. That's what the assumption and the methodology would be detailing, is that we've selected this particular location. The rent for this for 5 hours is $5,000. And so we think that's an appropriate unit cost for this. Meeting materials, for example, maybe the foam board printings, graphics, productions, easels, roll plots, sign-in sheets. If you want to provide snacks, you can potentially do that. And that's another example. So for meeting materials, that's what you would list in the assumptions and the associated costs with that. Staffing, how many staff? Is this 3 staff members at a certain hourly rate for 3 hours for the public meeting? And then a summary report, $500. That maybe that's 2 hours worth of staff time putting together a summary report of the public meeting. So this is just an example of breaking down each element of your scope, providing a unit cost for that scope, and then explaining why that unit cost is what it is. And again, another example, and this will be pretty standard, I think, for construction costs, is that you provide the actual construction elements. So concrete sidewalks at 5 feet, square yards. You're looking at 915 square yards. And so those are the unit quantities. That's at 150 a square yard. So for a total cost of 2.5 million. And so explaining that in the assumptions, where did this unit cost come from? And this should also reflect your design plans as well. So the unit quantity based on your design plans and the square yards that are available. So the item on the left, these are, at least these top 2 numbers, are TxDOT unit cost information. So if you're asking for construction, we would request that you use TxDOT's standard item information. They publish that every single year for just about every item you can possibly think of. And so that would be what would be included in the methodology is, hey, these are TxDOT unit costs, and the unit quantity is based on the design plans. We'll look at those design plans and see that those match up and are consistent. And so we have a breakdown of the total project costs. Contingency, 20%. That's typically industry standard. But is that appropriate for this scope of work? Provide that in the assumptions and methodology. Explain where that 20%, why that number is what it is, why you think it's appropriate for the project. And as long as that's reasonable and makes sense to us, then you're good to go. So these are really just kind of two examples showing you kind of what we are looking for. Again, there's flexibility in this process. Design your cost estimate and your scope the way you think is appropriate, but again, we are expecting it to be broken down, detailed, and defensible. So it's really about having that defensible cost estimate because again, these are cost estimates. They're not going to be, you never know how much a project is going to cost until you're done with it. But we're looking that you've gone through a deliberative process and you've got a solid estimate of what it's going to cost. So Ed, I think that's really all on the cost estimates. So yeah, Ed, you have a question?
Well, thank you for saying that the Campo is going to look at, the more recent activities that are happening that are causing inflation, and maybe 4% is not the best number to use at this point because there's a lot of uncertainties with things that are kind of going on.
Mm-hmm.
But regarding the time frame of the date that would make the estimate, do we do that for a January 2026, or do we make that estimate based on assuming we may get funding and selected in September of 2026?
I would say at submittal, so January 30th, like what's it cost today?
Okay.
And then we'll definitely take into consideration the evaluation process is going to take another 6 months. We'll build that in. That's a really good point.
Yeah, because and I wonder when the project gets selected, you go back to the estimate, whatever date that it was, and start adding the inflation amount. So I guess it kind of gets if you start trying to pigeonhole each project into a year of implementation, that you take that into account.
Mm-hmm.
Inflation, yeah.
Yeah, so just submit it today's cost, and we'll obviously that means we'll probably need to add another 6 months of inflation from selection and all the way up until we'll look at basically from January 30th what it costs up to whatever fiscal year and month and date you're looking to implement, and we'll make sure that inflation reflects that, even if it's like a year, 2.5 years as opposed to just an even 3. We'll make sure that's incorporated in there.
Yeah. Also, I would encourage people to take a look at, make sure you don't forget about construction inspection in your construction estimates.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Like construction inspections, design reviews for anything that you federalize, those can add up sometimes in design, and that's kind of getting into the construction and design requests. Like if you're at 100% design, but you're not at federal standards, you're gonna have to redo some of that design. That can cost some money. So just make sure you're looking at all of those things and adding those into your scope if necessary.
Yeah, one more question, and you may cover this later, but there's a fee that TxDOT charges for their review time.
Yeah.
Is that an eligible expense?
It is, and that's actually, I think I talk about funding requirements, but so you do have an upfront project cost. It's the direct state cost, which is basically a deposit you pay TxDOT at the execution of the advanced funding agreement. It's usually between 1% and 15% of the project costs. If you can include that for federal reimbursement, so you'll pay 80%, or the federal funding will pick up 80% of that costs. 20% will be picked up by you as the local government. If you do that, that rate should be 15%. That's probably the maximum rate that they would charge. And again, it's a deposit. This pays for the real, like for those construction inspections that TxDOT has to do. It pays for their oversight of the projects and all the things they have to do to manage your projects from the state perspective. And at the closeout, they will either reimburse you, whatever those real costs are, will be what you're charged. You'll either get reimbursed if there's a difference or charged if they go above and beyond. But yeah, that is absolutely an eligible expense. Include that in your scope and your cost estimate if you want to submit. Do want to point out that means we have to pay extra, put extra federal funding on a project. So it will impact your cost benefit analysis, which is based on the amount of federal funding we put on a project, but it is absolutely an eligible expense.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Hey, Fernando.
Oh, Ryan, you mentioned on that first slide that the cost estimate needs to be developed by a PE, does it have to be signed and sealed by PE as well?
No, just as long as it's certified PE. The plans themselves don't need to be signed and sealed.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
We're just making sure that a professional developed it more than anything else, that it's somebody who has experience doing it. Um, so yeah,
Okay. Thank you.
thanks. So I do want to be mindful of time. So funding requirements is kind of the only other. I'm going to go quickly through the rest of this, I think, just to make sure we stay on time. But again, sponsors need to indicate the amount of, so in the application, you'll have your total scope cost and then the amount of federal funding requested for the project and the phase submitted. Make sure that funding request is consistent with the information provided in the submitted cost estimate and scope. So again, federal funding will cover 80% of the project scope. The other 20% is provided by the local government as local match. And any additional funding outside of the federal funding request and required local match that is necessary to complete a project should be accounted for in the project funding documentation and indicated in the local contribution field in the application. So if you're overmatching, you can put whatever you are overmatching in the local contribution field. This is everything that's above and beyond the required 20%. So supporting the federal funding requests, sponsors need to demonstrate a committed funding for the project to support the upfront project expenditures, the required match, and as I just talked about, the initial direct payment for project administration. So commitments can be demonstrated through an approved local government resolution, certified financial statement that clearly identifies this project, an approved budget item that clearly identifies this project as being funded, or any other item that clearly demonstrates that funding is both available and committed to the submitted project. One thing I want to point out that I think the local government resolution is probably the most common thing that we see. If it's already included in a CIP and funded through through a certified CIP at the local government level, just make sure that that funding is available, can be spent on this project, and matches it verbatim the project scope. Because I think we've had some projects that are listed in the CIP but don't necessarily match the scope and limits of the product that was submitted. They have to match verbatim, so just make sure that that's included in there. Let's see, Michael, you have a question?
Yes, right quick. So there's three different funding buckets: STBG, possibly CRP, and TASA. If we submit for one, do you guys just kind of shuffle them around where they fit? And is that all right? Or are we sort of constrained to that bucket? What if we have a project that applies to all three buckets, so to speak?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And so you actually just submit your project, make sure it's eligible for any of the three. What we will do is we will slot it into the appropriate funding bucket based on the scope of work, and also funding availability, because a lot of anything that's eligible for CRP or TASA is also eligible for STBG. So we're going to slot those in where appropriate. Basically, as you submit your application, just make sure it's eligible for one of those eligibilities, but you don't really select what program you're applying for this time around. You just submit it. As long as it's eligible under STBG, you're eligible for the other two, and we'll slot it in. So with the funding requirements, again, you can demonstrate funding requirements in multiple ways. Just make sure that it's the governing body or individual that has express legal authority to commit the funding. In almost all cases, it's going to be the governing board or your council if you're a local government. But just make sure whoever is providing that funding has the legal authority to commit that funding. So sometimes the city manager, if the funding commitment is, say, less than $10,000 or something like that, that may not need council approval. It just needs city manager approval. In that case, the city manager can provide that letter and approval. But if it's anything that requires the governing body, you'll need to have that resolution. So just take that into consideration. There's a lot of different ways. It's really just dependent on your internal rules, but we'll be looking at that and making sure that the person who's committing that funding actually has the legal authority to do so. So coordination and agreements, sponsors need to demonstrate coordination with relevant stakeholders and demonstrate express permission and support from any governing body or jurisdiction that has legal authority over any aspect of the project, including the project location and scope. So sponsors need to provide all applicable agreements and legal permission required by the project, including interlocal agreements between partnering sponsors, on-system agreements with TxDOT. So if you're proposing an on-system project, you'll need to have concurrent from the TxDOT Austin District, and also any resolutions or official letters from the entire governing body of impacted jurisdictions. So typically, projects are submitted within the jurisdiction that's submitting them. But if you have a cross-jurisdictional project or program, we need to make sure that you have those appropriate agreements in place for those sponsors. We will accept general letters of support from individuals, but if they don't have any legal authority, it does provide additional context and support, but does not impact the readiness assessment directly. So planning. So that obviously we've talked a lot about the planning phase, where the initial development of the project. You take the planning activities, investigate the need for the product, develop those product concepts and address the need, and select a potential concept for further development. So we're just looking for a data-driven approach that provides methodical evaluation and development of the project. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker through these because we're 20 minutes out. But I can certainly revisit these if needed in the next webinar. So project sponsors need to demonstrate that the project, if you're asking where you are, that you've gone through the planning process and provide that relevant documentation and those excerpts in the application itself. We are also looking for public involvement. If it's the planning phase, that we demonstrate the project has gone in a broader planning process and included in broader planning documentation. If you're asking for engineering or construction, we're looking for more project direct public engagement. So just making sure that the public has had an opportunity to weigh in on the concepts that we're going to pay for engineering. And especially if it's going to construction, we want to make sure that the public has had an opportunity to provide input on that project prior to it going to construction. Engineering and design. Again, the construction phase, we are looking that engineering design has been substantially completed. This includes the design schematics, typical sections, geometric schematics, the utility and right-of-way determinations, and other requirements that are outlined in the TxDOT Project Development Manual. If you're asking for any of the earlier phases, please submit any engineering schematics you may have. If you're at 10% and you're asking for additional engineering, provide that 10%. Just depending on where you are, if you've got those schematics and you're asking for one of the earlier phases, please provide that information in the application. Environmental analysis. This has been expanded in the current application versus last time, and wanted to provide some additional detail and context on this. So projects that get federalized have to go through the NEPA process, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. Projects are not expected to have NEPA clearance at submittal. So if you're asking for construction funding, we don't expect you to have NEPA clearance. But what you should have is an iterative environmental review process relative to the phase requested. So if you're a construction project, you're not going to have NEPA clearance, but you should have looked at all of the environmental risk factors already. You should have your permitting in place, or at least identified the mitigation requirements, if it's in the floodplain that you've designed for that floodplain, things like that. And we're making sure that that's been incorporated in the project. And basically, you should have all of the pieces of NEPA essentially completed, and then we stitch them together through a formal NEPA process for the environmental clearance. But you should have, if you've done the project development process appropriately, you'll have all the components of NEPA already in place typically. Engineering and environmental phase, we're just looking at the environmental constraints and risk factors that have been identified in the planning process to ensure that the proposed project concept has been designed, or that we're going to be designing and engineering is feasible and doesn't contain an unacceptable risk of implementation. Angela, you have a question? Angela, you should be able to unmute.
Oh, sorry about that. So our proposal for funding is a project that would need to be federalized. Like otherwise, it would just be conducted with local funds. It's not on system. So we haven't even contemplated the NEPA process and would propose including that and funding as a step to complete this. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it depends. You're requesting construction funding?
Yes.
Okay. And well, so yes, you can ask for NEPA, obviously, but I would expect you to have at least, if it's eligible and ready for construction, that you've looked at some of the environmental components already. So, and that kind of gets to the next slide. And so basically, these are the components of NEPA that we'll be looking at. And this kind of gets to your question, Angela. So we're just looking to see what you've done environmentally. You don't have to have everything completed for NEPA, but we're going to look and see what you've done. And the application itself has a narrative field for each of these sections that are highlighted in bold here. Provide what you've done already, and we'll determine kind of where you sit and what it would take to get you to NEPA. So if you've already looked at threatened and endangered species, put that information in there. If you haven't looked at that, that might be something that you'll need to look at before you submit, because, you know, depending on where your project is, it may not have, you know, be in a territory for threatened and endangered species. But knowing that you've looked at it, I think is going to be pretty important. Kind of the same thing with, you know, is there a archaeological site or a historic property in the project location? Like, let us know if that is the case or not. And if you've gone through the planning process and the engineering process prior to construction, you've typically looked at all of that. So that you should have that information if you've gone through the engineering process, because you're going to look at the floodplain. You're going to look at the, you know, the water resources that are in your project location through the engineering process. If you're doing the engineering right, you're going to see all that already. And so that's really what this is about. Show us what information you have, and we'll see what you need to do to get to NEPA. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks. So again, as I mentioned, yeah, you'll just in this section in the end, just provide what you already have based on where you are, and we'll see what it takes for you to get to NEPA. And so finally, this is the last one, right-of-way acquisition, utility relocation. If you are asking for construction, you need to have all of your right-of-way identified, as well as utilities that need to be relocated. So you'll need to know what those requirements are. If you're asking for construction, your engineering process should have identified all of these things. And we're also looking that you are in the process, have or are in the process of acquiring these right-of-way parcels and relocating those utilities for construction at the time of submission. So we need to look, you should have everything identified if you're asking for construction, and then let us know where you are in the process of getting that right-of-way acquired and the utilities relocated. This is a really critical piece, because this can cause a significant delay in your projects. We will look at how complex the right-of-way acquisition is. Are there easements? Are they full-blown, you know, acreage acquisitions? Utility relocation? Are you relocating a water line, a pipeline, a gas pipeline, fiber? Fiber can add 2 or 3 years to a project. So we're going to look at the type of utility you need to relocate. So basically, we just need to know where you are. You've identified everything, and that where you are in the process, so that we can determine how long it'll take you to complete that process prior to construction. Paige, you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if joint bid utilities are considered relocations, because that, like, usually on projects, they clear all the utilities and then they do any water lines as like a joint bid during the construction period.
So the question, like, can you include that, or?
Yeah, like kind of, do you count that? Because it asks for number of utilities. Like, would you count joint bid as one of the utilities?
That's a good question. So I'm trying to think through that a little bit. And it's really about the risk. We're not going to fund the utility or right-of-way acquisition or the utility relocation if it doesn't pose an issue. And I think that this is where it'll come down to the joint bid. I think it's fine that it's a joint bid now that we're talking through this with construction, but you'll have to ensure that that utility relocation is not going to jeopardize the construction of the project. And you'll need to spell that out in your application, because you do identify like the acreage and the amount of utilities. If you're going to do a joint bid, just ensure that we're not going to start construction and all of a sudden there's a major issue with the joint utility relocation happening at the same time, because that would stop the project. So you'll just need to address that risk in the application and give us the assurances we need. Does that make sense?
Yes. And then my other question for right of way, like you just mentioned easements and you asked for a number of right of way acquisitions. Are easements, like say one of ours is like a trail project and there is an easement that we're getting from a neighborhood association. Does that count as like will we put one for right of way?
Yeah, I consider easements and right-of-way acquisition in the same bucket. But if you have that, easement agreement in place, and obviously easements carry a lot less risk than actually buying the right-of-way. And that's really the main thing with right-of-way and utility relocations is it going to impact the project schedule and the ability to go to construction on a project? And so, regardless of what you have identified, like just make sure you're addressing that risk and give us those assurances we need that you can pull that off. For utility or an easement, I know I think in the past project call there was a pretty significant easement on one of the projects, but they provided that neighborhood association agreement along with the application, so we knew that easement wasn't going to be an issue. So, but that's a good question. We kind of put it all in the same bucket.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. These are good questions, and I'll make sure too that I'll expand on these questions some more in the FAQ as well. So I appreciate these questions. So I know we're getting short on time. Really just wanted to, that was the end of that. What I'll do is I'll go quickly through the review process and then wrap up the webinar. But Ed, you have a question?
Well, it's going to be more of a compliment. I've been through this process many different times, and each time it's gotten better. And so I just wanted to say thank you to Ryan, you and your team. Because really what we're up against is a TxDOT process, which is easy for TxDOT to meet their own processes. But if they don't, then they have other products in line to get the funding spent at the time it needs to be. So we're, city and local governments are a little bit at a disadvantage in that respect. And so I'm hoping that as we go through implementation, that there's a recognition that, that what the communities have gone through, and not to and to have backup projects, but also allow that project to continue, because who knows what's going to happen in a very short time frame of implementing these projects. And that happens to TxDOT too, but they have other ways to kind of keep the money flowing out as they need to. So we should be recognize that the local governments encounter the same situations as TxDOT does, and if they're good projects, they should continue to be funded in future years. Other allocations.
That's a good point. No, I appreciate that, Ed. And yeah, that's this is really us trying to pick projects that can make it through the local government project procedures process. But and again, yeah, there's other we're going to over program a little bit to help manage, because at the end of the day, good projects are good projects, and we want to get them done and see them succeed. And I think that's as thorough and as this process is, it's not. It's really there to help, make sure that those projects can make it through, because it is a lot, and y'all have a lot. And this application process is the easy part. If your project gets selected, well, that's just the starting gun for a very in-depth and long process. And so, it's just the beginning. So if you're complaining when you're doing the application, just think this is just step one. So, but we do recognize that it is a lot of work for all of you, and appreciate all the effort y'all put into the projects that we do see done, the ones that Christine has been tracking over the last few months, the ones that make it through. Like it's it's a lot. It says a lot about the local governments that are pulling these off, because it's a lot of work. So I digress a little bit, but that's a good point, Ed. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So I know we're kind of short on time, so I'm just going to briefly just want to tell you how we review things, just so you know what the expectations are once you submit a project. So basically what we'll do, you submit your application, we will internally do a primary readiness review using that form that's in the guide for project selection. We'll just go step by step and review your project application. At that point, we'll have a draft review form done, and then we send that review along with your application to we have a general engineering consultant that will help us review, do a secondary review. TxDOT, the Austin district, will also do a review of your project to see where it would fall in the LGP process. Their environmental team will also look at the NEPA process for your individual project. So we'll get those comments. Once they've gotten that secondary review is completed, it'll come back to staff. We'll combine those reviews, do some QA, QC to make sure that everybody saw the same things and that everybody's in agreement on where your project falls in readiness. At that point, we'll do a full readiness assessment report. We'll finalize it. We'll send that back to you. And at that point, we'll do individual project sponsored debriefs. So what that looks like, this project readiness evaluation report, these pages on the right are actually in the guide to project selection in the appendices. So you'll see exactly what we're going to do line by line. I would encourage you to go through your projects and go through this checklist line by line to see what we're going to be seeing. So hopefully there will be no surprises on the readiness review. Be realistic about your project and go through this and fill this out. And so again, we're going to be looking at all these things, and I do want to point out in particular the environmental section. We're going to be looking at those particular pieces. Just because something is a yes does not mean it's kicked out of readiness, particularly on the environmental section. Like say this area contains biological resources for threatened and endangered species. If you click yes and we see that, that's not going to mean your project isn't ready. We're going to make sure that you're addressing that issue through NEPA or through the permitting process, that you've got the appropriate permits. So yes, it's not meaning it's kicked out. It just means that this is an issue. We need to just make sure it's addressed. But anyways, that's in particular for the environmental section in particular. So finally, yeah, and this is what you'll get back. We will fill out this form line by line. You'll have comments from the review team for each section. And then ultimately we'll have a ready or not ready determination. So I did want to kind of point out, this is kind of what happened in the last project call. Issues that were identified mainly came out of the scope, cost estimate, or funding requirements. Either the scope was unclear, the activities weren't eligible, there was no documentation, or there was significant inconsistencies between the cost estimate, scope, and funding requirements. Cost estimate, oftentimes we didn't have methodology. There may have been significant calculation errors. So these are just things to watch out for when you're going through your process. I just want to be clear. I think the application itself and the guidance was really updated to address some of these things to make it clear, but I think it was always good to point out these are the things we saw in the last call. So just be mindful of these when you're putting your application together. So finally, in the last couple of minutes, I want to go through specific readiness resources. These are links in the guide for project selection. Everything that is in bold are actually direct links to these resources. These are TxDOT and FHWA resources. But I would encourage you to visit TxDOT and the Federal Highway Administration's web pages. They do have a lot more information than what is provided here. These are just the highlights that I think are relevant to your projects. Again, TxDOT has a project development process manual. It was updated last November, about a year ago. Fantastic manual that kind of goes through TxDOT's internal project development process that I mentioned earlier. The local government project management guide, I have a copy of this sitting on my desk that is out of date at this point, but this actually goes step by step what will happen to your project once we federalize it, if it gets selected for funding. So as you're building out your schedule, I would encourage you to review this management guide, go through it. It will tell you exactly what you're going to have to go through for your project, and has links to all of the other resources regarding each particular section. Read this, at least skim it, look through the table of contents. It will tell you kind of what the expectations are, and will help you select not only the best products for federalizing, but will help you kind of suss out what your schedule will look like. Again, there's a policy manual that's included with the LGPP, a best practices workbook if you're interested in looking at that. And then the local government projects frequently used forms and documents. This actually has a couple of resources. If you're looking to develop something like a schedule, they have sample forms and documents in here. There might be something you can use for your application, so I would encourage you to look at that as well. I think there's like 300 to 400 documents in there, so it's a lot. So yeah, so I know we are right on time. Next steps. So I'm going to expand on the questions y'all provided today. So thank you so much for asking the questions, and for the points that y'all brought up. These are really, really helpful and will help me provide additional guidance as we go through this process. It'll really strengthen the information I can provide. And next week, I think this Wednesday on November 5th, we'll go through the benefit evaluation process. So that will be how we evaluate your projects for benefits. This will be a much faster, or I'd say it's just as important as the project readiness, but it's a little simpler, I think, as far as the nuances go. So we'll go through the benefit evaluation process, and that'll be the same time, 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Again, please send any questions to funding@campotexas.org. I think after information session 3, we will post all of these webinars online, along with the transcript and the presentations. And then I'll be doing the open office hours leading up to the January 30th application due date. So that is it. If there are any final questions or comments, please let me know. I know I've spoken a lot, so I appreciate your patience with that. Nobody wants to be subjected to this terrible accent for an hour and a half, but it is what it is. So I appreciate your patience and for the questions. So thank you. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me afterwards. But with that, I'll conclude the webinar. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, y'all.